What would you do if everything you owned fit inside a canvas sack, and the only thing of any worth was a tool most people wouldn't recognize? What if the one person who believed in you was already gone, and the whole world was telling you that what they'd left behind was worthless? That you were worthless? Pull up a chair and settle in. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, as we tell the story of Marin Doyle and the forgotten forge on Cutter's Creek. Marin Doyle came into Harwick Crossing on a Tuesday in early spring, which is to say she arrived with the mud. The road into town was a soft brown river of it, and her boots were soaked through before she'd gone 2 blocks. She was 21 years old, though she looked older around the eyes, and she carried everything she had in a canvas pack, slung over one shoulder and a leather roll tucked under her arm. The leather roll was tied shut with a cord of braided horsehair. She did not set it down, not even when she stopped at the edge of the main street to get her bearings. Harwick Crossing was not a large town, but it was a proud one. The storefronts had fresh paint. The church steeple was the tallest thing for 20 miles. The people on the boardwalk were dressed in the particular way of small-town prosperity, not rich, but deliberate about looking respectable. A woman in a green wool coat glanced at Marin and looked away too quickly. A man in a shopkeeper's apron watched her from a doorway with his arms crossed. She was used to that kind of looking. It meant, "You don't belong here." She kept walking. The reason Marin Doyle had come to Harwick Crossing was a piece of paper. It was folded small and tucked into the inside pocket of her coat, close against her ribs. It was a deed, unsigned and half-completed, for a piece of land on the north edge of town where Cutter's Creek bent hard to the east. The property had a small structure on it. The paper called it a smithing outbuilding, condition unknown. The county assessor's office had been holding the deed for 3 years on account of unpaid taxes. The land had belonged to Theodore Alp, and Theodore Alp had been the closest thing Marin had ever had to family. He was her mother's uncle, though she'd never called him anything but Theo. He had taken her in at 14 after her mother passed, and her father, well, her father had made his choice, and the choice wasn't her. Theo was a blacksmith who worked out of a small shed behind a rented house in another county entirely. A man who smelled of iron and coal smoke, and occasionally of the linseed oil he rubbed into his hands to keep them from cracking. He was not a gentleman in the way that word usually means, but he was a steady one. He did not raise his voice. He did not break his promises. He taught her everything he knew. For 6 years, Marin had learned the forge. She learned to read iron the way a physician reads a face, by color, by texture, by the particular way it moved under the hammer. She learned to coax a hinge into being, to shape a latch, to draw out a hook that would hold a gate through 30 winters. Theo said she had a gift for understanding the material, which coming from him was the highest praise she would ever receive. Then, 2 winters ago, his heart had simply stopped. He was found in the shed, sitting on his stool, his hammer still in his hand. The neighbor who found him said it looked almost peaceful. What he left behind was not much. A rented house that belonged to the landlord. A set of tools that the landlord immediately claimed against back rent. But in a tin box buried under the floorboards of the shed, Marin found the deed, a short letter, in Theo's handwriting, and $4 silver wrapped in a cloth. "The land on Cutter's Creek is yours if you want it," the letter said. "I never went back. I should have. The forge is there. Whether it's any good after all this time I cannot say, but you know how to work. That's more than most people start with." That was the entirety of the letter. No sentiment, no explanation. Just Theo, to the last. It had taken her 2 years to save enough for the journey and the deed fees. 2 years of mending farm equipment for neighbors, of doing piecework at a foundry in the next town over, of sleeping in rooms barely bigger than closets and eating what she could afford. She had kept the leather tool roll with her the whole time, never letting it out of her sight. It held 6 of Theo's tools, the ones she'd managed to keep before the landlord got to the rest. His favorite set punch, a pair of tongs with worn wooden handles, a small ball-peen hammer he'd carried since before she was born. 3 other things she used so often they'd become an extension of her own hands. She carried them like a prayer. She carried them like a debt she intended to pay. The land office in Harwick Crossing was run by a clerk named Mr. Fawcett, a man of approximately 60, who wore his importance the way some people wear too much cologne. He looked at the deed, looked at Marin, and looked at the deed again. "The Alp property," he said in the tone of a man recalling something unpleasant. "On Cutter's Creek." "That's right," Marin said. "You're related to Theodore Alp." "I am." He set the deed on the counter and smoothed it with his palm. "Miss," he started. "Doyle," she said. "Marin Doyle. Miss Doyle." He took off his spectacles and polished them, which she would learn was his method of buying time. That property has been sitting vacant for going on 9 years. The Forge building, well, the roof came off in the big ice storm of 19. What's left standing, I couldn't honestly tell you. He put the spectacles back on. The tax debt comes to $31. You'd be paying $31 for a pile of fieldstone and whatever the creek hasn't taken. Marin laid the money on the counter. $31.20, every cent she had in the world. Fawcett counted it twice. He looked at her for a long moment. Not unkindly, exactly, but with the particular expression of a man watching someone make a mistake in real time. He said nothing further. He processed the deed, stamped it in 3 places, and slid it back across the counter. "The path's off Alderman Road," he said. "Follow the creek sound." She folded the deed and put it in her coat, next to the letter. She was almost to the door when she heard Fawcett say it, not quite under his breath, to no one in particular. $31 for a broken chimney and a mud hole. Lord have mercy. She walked out into the thin spring sunshine and did not look back. The word traveled fast in small towns, faster, it seemed, than any person could carry it. By the time Marin had walked 2 blocks toward the livery to ask about borrowing a cart, she was aware that people were watching with a different quality of attention. The shopkeeper in the doorway had been replaced by 2 women who stopped talking the moment she passed. A boy of about 12 stared openly from across the street. She was nearly at the livery when a man stepped out of the feed store directly into her path. He was perhaps 50, broad across the chest, with the ruddy complexion of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors, and a suit that said he'd rather not have to anymore. He had the look of a man who had decided at some point in his life that he was the most important person in any given room and had never been sufficiently contradicted. "You're the Alp girl," he said. "Not a question." "Marin Doyle," she said for the 2nd time that morning. "Theodore Alp was my great-uncle, Renard Finch," he said, and the way he said his own name suggested she should recognize it. "I own the Finch lumber operation, quarter-mile east of your—" He paused. He looked her over with open assessment. "I made an offer on that parcel 2 years ago. Offered the county $40 for it. They held it for the deed process." There was something aggrieved in his voice, as if Marin had personally arranged this to inconvenience him. "I didn't know that," she said, which was true. "I wanted the stone," he said flatly. "The fieldstone in those walls is good quality. I'd have used it for a new mill foundation." He looked at the leather roll under her arm. "What exactly is it you're planning to do with a ruined forge on a creek bank?" "Work," she said. He waited, as if this couldn't possibly be the complete answer. It was. Renard Finch's face did a complicated thing. He had expected protest or apology, or at minimum some performance of uncertainty. Her stillness seemed to irritate him in a way he couldn't quite place. "The forge hasn't had a fire in it in nearly a decade," he said. "The bellows will be rotted through. The anvil, if it's even still there, will be seized with rust. The creek floods in spring. You'll spend your first month pulling mud out of the building, if the building's still standing." He tilted his head. "I'll give you $50 for the deed, right now. You'd walk away with $19 to the good." Marin looked at him steadily. "No thank you, Mr. Finch." He blinked. He had not expected that either. "The offer won't stay open," he said. "I understand," she said. She stepped around him and continued toward the livery. She heard him call after her, something about the spring floods and good money after bad, but she kept her pace even and her eyes ahead. Her hands had clenched inside her coat pockets. She unclenched them deliberately, one finger at a time. Theo had taught her that too. To put anger somewhere useful. The forge, he used to say, runs on controlled heat. You let it go wild, you burn the whole shop down. She was tying down a borrowed handcart in front of the livery when she became aware of someone watching her from the bench outside the barber shop next door. An old man, small and very still, with skin weathered to the color of creek-bottom clay, and eyes that were sharp and brown and entirely present. He had a piece of wood in his hands that he was turning slowly, though he didn't appear to be carving it so much as thinking about it. He waited until she had finished with the cart straps before he spoke. "Forge on the creek," he said. Not a question, not quite a statement. A kind of acknowledgement. Marin looked at him. "You know the property? Knew your great-uncle." He turned the piece of wood over. "Name's Ira Coffey. I had the saddlery on this street for 30 years. Theodore Alp did all my hardware. Good worker, quiet man." He paused. "Left in a hurry. I didn't know why he left," Marin said honestly. "Family business," Ira Coffey said, in the tone of a man who knew and had decided that wasn't his story to tell. "The forge itself is sound. Stone doesn't care about time, or not much. The chimney's the question." He looked at her. "You know the work?" "I do," she said. He studied her for a moment the way Theo used to study a piece of iron before committing to a strike, looking for the grain of the thing, the hidden stress. Then he gave a small nod, as if she'd passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. Creek floods in March, he said. You've missed the worst of it. Forge floor'll be silted up, but the stone'll have held. The bellows. He hesitated. I wouldn't count on the bellows. I can make new ones, Marin said. Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the shape of one. Hardware stores got leather, he said. Tell Gower I said to give you the good stock. She thanked him. She meant it. He had already gone back to looking at his piece of wood. The path off Alderman Road was less a path than a memory of one. It had been swallowed almost entirely by young alder and river willow, the ground between the trees soft and treacherous underfoot. Marin led the handcart slowly, testing each step, listening to the sound of the creek grow louder through the trees. The spring smell was everywhere. Cold water and new growth, and the particular sweetness of wet earth warming up. She smelled the forge before she saw it. Not fire. There hadn't been fire there in years, but the deep mineral ghost of it. Iron and old ash and coal dust absorbed so thoroughly into the stone that the smell would probably outlast the building. She had grown up with that smell. It was the smell of safety, of work, of Theo. She pushed through the last screen of willows and stopped. The forge building was small, maybe 20 feet square, built from the same flat fieldstone that cropped up all over this part of the country. 3 of the 4 walls were standing. The 4th, the south-facing wall, had partially collapsed inward, taking most of the roof with it. What remained of the roof was a single rafter, still somehow bolted at both ends, spanning the gap like a defeated bridge. The chimney stood intact at the north end, tall and narrow, and apparently unmoved by everything that had fallen around it. It looked stubborn, she thought. It looked like Theo. The forge floor was silted over, as Ira Coffey had predicted. A thick layer of creek mud, gray-brown and dried to a cracked surface in the patches where the collapsed roof had let in sunlight. Weeds had come through the gaps in the stone floor. A family of something, mice probably, had established themselves in what was left of the bellows, which were indeed rotted beyond saving. The anvil was in the corner. It had not moved. It was seized with surface rust, orange-brown and rough to the touch, but when she knocked on it with her knuckle it rang, faint and deep, with a sound that was entirely correct. She stood in the center of the ruined floor and looked around her. The cold weight of the thing settled over her. $31, every cent she had. For this, she thought about Renard Finch and his $50 offer. She thought about Mr. Fawcett and his Lord have mercy. She thought about the women on the boardwalk who had stopped talking when she passed. She thought about her father who had made his choice. She put all of it in a box somewhere behind her sternum and closed the lid. Then she unrolled the leather tool roll on top of the anvil, the only flat surface available, and looked at Theo's tools laid out in a row. The set punch, the tongs, the ball-peen hammer with its handle worn smooth in exactly the places his hand had worn it. She put her palm over the hammer and felt the familiar weight of it. You know how to work, he had written. That's more than most people start with. She took a breath of cold forge air. She picked up the hammer. She started with the mud. It took 3 days just to clear the floor down to flagstone. She shoveled mud into a barrow and wheeled it to the creek bank, load after load, until her shoulders burned and her back had settled into a constant low-grade protest that she ignored by paying attention to other things. The flagstones emerged slowly, dark gray, pitted from years of use, stained with old scale and coal dust but solid, impossibly solid. She ran her hand along the surface of them and felt a rush of something she didn't have a word for. Relief, maybe, or gratitude. The ground had held. The collapsed south wall was next. Some of the fallen stone was still usable. She stacked it carefully along the creek bank, sorted by size. The rafter that had survived she left in place. It would anchor the new roof. She found, under the rubble of the wall, the remains of the old coal box. The wood was gone, but the iron liner was intact, just surface rust. She cleaned it with a wire brush until it gleamed. On the 5th day, a boy appeared at the edge of the tree line. He was perhaps 15, skinny in the way of boys who have recently gotten tall very quickly, with a serious expression and a pair of work gloves that were too big for his hands. Mr. Coffey sent me, he said. I'm Pell Sutter. He said you might need a hand with the roof framing. Marin looked at him. Can you frame a roof? I helped build the new church hall last year, he said, and the feed store extension. Do you know anyone with a horse and a timber wagon? My uncle does, he said. Tell your uncle, Marin said, that I'll pay in ironwork. Whatever he needs next season. Pell Sutter went away and came back the following morning with his uncle and a wagon bed of rough-cut pine lumber. His uncle, a man named Grover Sutter, who had the unhurried manner of someone who had never once been in a hurry and had never once regretted it, walked the perimeter of the forge building, studied the chimney, poked at the standing walls in several places, and said, "Roof's the easy part. South wall. You're going to need to rebuild it from the third course up." "I know," Marin said. "I can help with that too," he said. "I'm a mason by first trade. Lumber's just what the county needed more of." She looked at him. In her experience, generosity from strangers came with an attached string. "Why?" she asked, because she had learned that asking directly saved time. Grover Sutter scratched the back of his neck. "Ira Coffey is my wife's father," he said. "He says you know what you're doing. That's good enough for me." He paused. "Also, I need 3 new gate hinges and a latch set before summer, and there isn't a smith within 15 miles who does decent work." There it was. Not charity, then. Trade that she understood. They shook on it. Over the next 3 weeks, the forge came back. Grover and Pell rebuilt the south wall. Marin hauled stone alongside them, until Grover told her not unkindly that her lifting was fine but her mortar mixing was excellent, and maybe she should focus on that. She focused on the mortar. She also rebuilt the bellows, stretching new leather over the old frame, riveting it with small tacks from the hardware store. She relaned the coal box. She cleaned the chimney flue from the top down, which was a cold and filthy job involving a rope and a stiff brush and a great deal of very old soot. When Grover and Pell finished the roof, a simple gable of pine, tight and clean, she stood back and looked at the building from the creek bank. 4 walls, a roof, a chimney. It was not beautiful. It was entirely itself. She fired the forge for the first time. On a morning in late April, the air still cold enough to see her breath. She used a small charge of coal, just enough to test the draw. The bellows worked. The chimney pulled clean. The heat that built in the firebox was even and strong, and when she held her hand over the coals, she felt the familiar wave of it against her palm. Not burning, but alive. She put the first piece of iron in and watched it move through the colors, black to deep, red to orange, climbing toward the yellow-white. That meant it was ready. When it reached that bright, almost liquid state, she pulled it with the tongs, set it on the anvil, and swung Theo's hammer. The sound rang out across Cutter's Creek, off the water, up through the willows, into the cool morning air. It was the sound of something starting. She had her first real commission within the week. Grover Sutter's 3 gate hinges, as agreed. She worked from his measurements, forging each hinge to match, drawing out the leaves on the anvil until they were even and flat, punching the pinholes clean. She delivered them on a Thursday morning, and he installed them on Friday, and on Saturday he mentioned the work to his neighbor, who mentioned it to his brother-in-law, and by the following Tuesday there was a man at her door with a broken wagon wheel hub and a look of cautious hope. She fixed the hub. The week after that, a woman came with a set of kitchen hooks she'd had in mind for 2 years and never found a smith who would bother with something so small. Marin made them, 8 hooks, graduated in size, with a decorative curl at the top that the woman hadn't asked for but cried a little when she saw. Word moved through Harwick. Crossing the way, water moves through limestone, slowly, invisibly, following the grain of the rock, and then suddenly you look up and there's a spring where there wasn't one before. People came with jobs that the nearest other smith was too far away to bother with. A broken plow coulter, a cracked axle collar, a set of fire pokers for the new hotel. Small work, most of it. Work that didn't seem worth the trouble until it wasn't getting done. Marin took every job. She kept her prices fair, low enough that farmers didn't have to think twice, high enough that she could eat and buy coal, and slowly, piece by piece, replace the tools she'd lost. She worked from first light until she couldn't see anymore. She ate simply. She slept on a cot in the corner of the forge under a heavy quilt, with the smell of iron in the air and the sound of the creaks through the wall. She was not happy, exactly. She was not unhappy. She was occupied, which was a different and in some ways better thing. Renard Finch did not visit. She was aware of him the way you're aware of weather, coming from the wrong direction. A pressure change, a shift in the air. She heard his name often enough. He was the largest employer in the area. He had opinions about the town, and the town had learned to accommodate them. She filed the information away and kept working. What came to find her in the 7th week was not trouble she had been expecting. It was Pell Sutter, running. He came through the tree line at a pace that had nothing casual about it, and she put down her hammer and met him at the door. Fire at the Keller farm. He got out, between breaths. Grain barn. They got it out, but the main barn door is jammed shut, the latch mechanism bent in the heat, and there's livestock inside. Mr. Keller can't get it open. The animals are scared and the air's still bad. She was already unrolling the tool roll. "How far?" she said. "Half-mile," he said. "Maybe less." She took the ball peen and the heaviest of the tongs and her pry bar, which she'd made herself in the third week and was quietly proud of, and she ran. The Keller farm was still smoking when she got there. Not burning, but the particular gray exhalation of something that had been burning recently and wasn't quite finished thinking about it. The main barn doors were large, built from heavy timber, and the iron latch mechanism that held them shut had warped in the heat from the adjacent fire. It had fused, essentially, into a single locked piece. A man she took to be Leonard Keller, 50 or so, soot-streaked, vibrating with controlled panic, was at it with a crowbar and getting nowhere. "You're the smith," he said, more statement than question. "Step back," she said. She studied the latch for 30 seconds. It was not complicated, just wrong. The heat had expanded the iron unevenly, seizing the catch against the keep. She took the ball peen and struck it in a specific sequence, 3 light blows to the top of the mechanism, 2 harder ones to the side, listening each time for the shift. On the 7th blow, something gave, a faint internal click, and the latch moved. The doors swung open. The livestock came out in a rush, and Leonard Keller went in after them, calling names. His wife appeared from somewhere behind Marin and grabbed her arm. "My son is in there," she said. Her voice was terribly even. "He went back in for the calves." Marin went in. The air inside was thick and wrong. Not flames, but smoke residue, the kind that sits in your lungs and makes you stupid. She pulled her collar up over her mouth and moved toward the sound of coughing, which led her to the far corner, where a boy of maybe 8 was on his knees, next to 2 terrified calves, his arms around the neck of the nearest one, refusing to let go. "Come on," she said, crouching next to him. "I've got the door open. They'll come." "They're scared," he said. "I know," she said. "We're all going to walk out together." She didn't carry him. He was too old for that, and he would have resisted. But she got his hand, and she got the lead rope on the nearer calf, and she talked steadily as they moved toward the light, not saying anything particularly meaningful, just the sound of a voice staying calm, and they came out into the spring air, all 4 of them, coughing and blinking. Leonard Keller's wife put her arms around her son and looked at Marin over his head with an expression that Marin had to look away from. It was too much to receive directly. "Come, inside," the woman, her name was Dorothea Keller, said when she'd gotten herself back. "Please. At least, let us feed you." At the kitchen table, while Marin ate a bowl of soup that was the best thing she'd had in months, the Kellers asked her questions. Where was she from? How long had she been at the forge? Had she studied with anyone? She answered simply, without elaboration. "We didn't know about you," Leonard Keller said. He seemed to mean it as more than it sounded. "We've been driving to Westfield for smithing work for 2 years, since old Barnard retired." "I've only been here 8 weeks, Marin said. Still, he turned his soup spoon in his hands. "We'll be back, with proper work. Not just," he gestured toward the barn, "not just emergencies. All work is proper," she said. He looked at her, and something in his face shifted, an adjustment, a recalibration. He nodded slowly, as if she had said something he intended to think about later. The Kellers were not quiet people. They were, in fact, exactly the kind of people who told stories, and the story they told when they went to church that Sunday, and to the feed store on Monday, and to the Women's Society on Wednesday, was the story of Marin Doyle, who had opened a stuck barn door with 7 hammer strikes and walked into bad air to bring out a boy who wouldn't leave his calves. Harwick Crossing heard it and was still for a moment. Then it reconsidered. The quality of attention shifted again. Not the suspicious sideways watching of her first day, not the pity-flavored observation of the weeks after, but something more direct. People started coming to the forge who had not come before. Not with emergencies, not with small work, but with real commissions. The hotel wanted a full set of interior hardware for its new east wing: hinges, locks, door pulls, window latches. A farmer named Declan Rowe wanted a set of cultivator teeth that would break the particular kind of hard pan on his North 40 that had defeated every off-the-shelf option he'd tried. That one interested her. She spent 2 days on Declan Rowe's cultivator teeth, experimenting with the temper, adjusting the angle of the blade, testing different shapes against a piece of hardpan he'd brought as a sample. When she got it right, she knew. The iron sang a different note under the hammer, settled differently against the stone. She made him 4 teeth and charged him for 3. He brought her a side of salt pork the following week. She didn't refuse it. Word of the hotel commission reached Renard Finch on a Thursday. She knew because he appeared at the forge door on a Friday afternoon, which she had privately been expecting. He looked at the building, the new roof, the repointed south wall, the fire burning clean in the forge. with the expression of a man who had made a calculation that wasn't coming out the way he'd expected. He didn't bother with preamble. "You turned down $50, he said. "I did," Marin said, without stopping work. She was finishing a set of fire tongs for the hotel, and she was at a stage that didn't permit interruption. "You had nothing," he said. "No tools, no stock, no customers." "What made you think I had tools?" she said. She glanced briefly at the leather roll hanging on its peg on the wall. "I had what I needed." He watched her work for a moment. She was shaping the joint of the tong, a fussy piece of work that required attention, and she gave it the attention it required, which meant she did not look at him. "I need ironwork," he said finally. "The new mill building. Hardware throughout. It's a large commission." She set the tong on the anvil and looked at him directly for the first time since he'd arrived. He was not a stupid man. She could see him understanding, in this moment, that the conversation had changed. That he was standing in her building, asking for something, and the math was different than it had been in the street 2 months ago. "I take commissions in the order I receive them," she said. "You'd be behind the hotel, and the row farm, and a few others." Something moved across his face, not quite humility. More like the early stage of it, the part where you recognize the territory even if you haven't decided to walk into it yet. "Understood," he said. "Leave me the measurements," she said, "and I'll tell you when I can get to it." He left the measurements. He did not make any further offers to buy the property. The summer that followed was the hardest work of Marin Doyle's life, and also, though she couldn't have named it as such at the time, being too tired in the evenings to name much of anything. The beginning of something she hadn't known to want. Pell Sutter became a regular presence at the forge, sweeping, carrying coal, working the bellows when she needed a third hand, asking questions that were often better than she expected. She started answering them at length. Then she started showing him. Then, without either of them deciding it, she was teaching him. And he was learning in that particular way of young people who are exactly where they are supposed to be. Fast and hungry and a little reckless, but with the kind of underlying instinct that can be shaped. He broke 3 things before he made anything good. She had expected 2, so she considered this a reasonable start. Ira Coffey came by the forge once a month, on no particular schedule. He never came with work. He would sit on the bench she'd built outside the door. She'd built it partly for this purpose, though she hadn't quite admitted that to herself, and watch the creek, and occasionally say something worth considering. He told her things about Theo, small things, incidents from the years before she'd known him. It was like being handed pieces of a person she'd known all along, but was only now learning to see whole. One evening in late August, Ira Coffey looked at the forge building, at the firelight moving in the window, at the new sign she'd hung on the doorpost. "Style Smithing," painted in plain black letters by Pell's mother, who turned out to have a gift for it, at the well-worn path from the road to the door, and said he'd be satisfied. Marin looked at the building, too. Satisfied was, she thought, exactly the right word. Not proud, not amazed. Satisfied. The word Theo would have used. "I hope so," she said. "He left in a hurry," Ira said again as he had that first morning. There was a difficulty with a man who thought he could push Theodore Alp off a piece of property he'd paid for. He turned the piece of wood in his hands. It didn't work, in the end. But your great-uncle was a man who preferred to leave trouble behind him rather than stand in it. He went. He didn't come back. He paused. I think he always meant to. Time got away from him. Marin thought about the tin box under the floorboards, the $4 silver, the deed. "He sent me instead," she said. "He did," Ira Coffey agreed. "The autumn arrived the way it does in that part of the country, suddenly, without much ceremony. One morning, the willows were green, and the next they were yellow, and the creek ran a shade colder, and the mornings had teeth in them." Marin banked the forge fire earlier in the evenings, and let it die slower, so the building held heat through the night. She had moved past the cot. She had a proper bed now, in a small room she'd partitioned at the back of the building, with pine boards and her own cut-nail hardware. And she had a stove for the room, which Pell had helped her haul up from the creek road on a borrowed sledge. She was not wealthy. She was not even comfortable, not by most definitions. But she was out of debt, and she was working, and the work was hers, and some evenings when she sat in the doorway of the forge with a cup of coffee and the sound of the creek coming through the willows, she felt something she had no name for. It was quiet and solid and had been arrived at through difficulty. It was, she thought, probably what Theo had meant by satisfied. The commission that changed things, changed how the town understood her, changed what she understood about herself. Came in October, from an unexpected direction. A woman came to the forge on a Tuesday morning, well-dressed, and clearly unaccustomed to the particular atmosphere of a working smithy. She looked at the soot and the coal and the hanging tools with polite alarm, and then she looked at Marin with a kind of careful assessment. Her name was Isabel Prentice, and she was the wife of a doctor in the next county, and she had heard, through a series of connections she outlined in some detail, about Marin Doyle and the work she did. She had a commission, she said. That was not metalwork exactly, or not only metalwork. She reached into her bag and produced a small, broken thing, a medical device, a surgical clamp, used in difficult deliveries. One of the arms was cracked, an old repair badly done, now failed entirely. The clamp had belonged to her husband's teacher, a physician who had practiced here in this valley 40 years ago, and it was irreplaceable in the way that instruments tied to particular histories are irreplaceable. Her husband could buy a new one. He didn't want a new one. He wanted this one. Marin turned the clamp over in her hands. It was fine work, the original, precision tolerances, a mechanism that still moved correctly on the undamaged side. The repair would be delicate. She'd never done medical instruments before. I can't promise a perfect outcome, she said honestly. This is precision work outside my usual range. Isabel Prentice looked at her. I was told you are exactly the kind of person who says that before doing something exactly right, she said. Marin almost smiled. She spent 4 days on the clamp. She made 3 attempts before she got the repair right. The arm remade from a piece of the best high-carbon stock she had, fitted to match the original, the joint dressed until it moved without play. When she tested the mechanism it was, if she was honest, slightly better than the original. She wouldn't say so aloud, but she noted it. Isabel Prentice returned on the 5th day and stood in the forge doorway, turning the repaired clamp in her hands. Her face went through several things. She paid what Marin asked without comment, and then said, "My husband is going to want to meet you." The doctor, a man named Everett Prentice, thoughtful and precise in the way of people who have spent a lot of years paying close attention to small things, came to the forge the following week. He brought the clamp and 2 other instruments that needed work. He also brought a question. There was a medical supplies dealer in the capital, he explained, who supplied instruments to physicians across 4 counties. The instruments were adequate, but the quality was inconsistent. Tolerances that should have been tight were loose. Mechanisms that should have been smooth were sticky. He had been looking for a smith he trusted enough to recommend to his colleagues. He looked at Marin steadily over his spectacles. "Would you be interested in medical instrument work?" he said. She thought about the clamp, the precision of it, the puzzle of the mechanism, the particular satisfaction of work where there was no margin for almost right. "Yes," she said. That winter, Marin Doyle took on 6 new commissions from physicians in the area, word having traveled through Dr. Prentice's network with the particular velocity of professional recommendations among people who rarely trusted anything. The work was meticulous and slow, and paid better than anything she'd done before. She had to expand her tool selection, source better stock, learn new techniques from books she ordered from the capital. She was awake later and up earlier. She had never been so tired or so interested. Renard Finch's mill commission came through in December, slotted in around the medical work in the order it had been received. She did it well. She did all commissions well. That was not a distinction she was willing to vary. When she delivered the finished hardware, his foreman signed the receipt and said, "Mr. Finch says you do good work." It was the entirety of the message. It was, she thought, probably as much as Renard Finch knew how to offer, and she received it as the thing it was. The day the year turned, Marin Doyle stood in the open door of her forge in the early morning, the cold coming off the creek in a pale mist, the fire already going behind her and its warmth pressing against her back. The forge building was hers. The deed registered, the walls solid, the roof tight, the sign over the door. The tools on their pegs, Theo's among the others now, each hanging in the place that made the most sense for how she worked. The path from Alderman Road to her door was worn smooth and wide. People came up it now without needing to know it was there. The Sutter boy was inside, rebuilding the bellows housing that had finally gotten old, whistling something tuneless and slightly off-key. Ira Coffey's bench was empty this early, but would be occupied later. In the afternoon, when the cold eased enough to sit outside, she looked at the creek and the willows and the town that had, slowly and without ceremony, made room for her in it. She thought about a girl of 14 with no place to go, brought into a smoky shed by a quiet man who had decided, without much discussion, that she was worth teaching. She thought about the tool roll, hanging on its peg inside. Some things get handed down not as gifts but as instructions. This is what you do. This is who we are. Now you carry it. She had carried it. She would keep on. Tell us something in the comments. Have you ever held on to a piece of someone you loved, something small, and let it lead you somewhere new? We'd be glad to hear it. And if Marin's story settled something in you, leave us a like and find us next time. We'll have another one waiting.